Morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to Kingston Writers Fest. My name is Ara McCauley. I'm the Artistic Director of the festival, and I'm pleased to present our event today, Herbariums, Meditations on Forgotten Flora. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that the land on which this festival customarily takes place and where I am today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. We hope that you followed the sponsorship acknowledgement video that was playing before the event started. I'd like to thank Canada Council, Canadian Heritage, Ontario Arts Council, and the City of Kingston and Kingston Arts Council for their ongoing support of this festival. We're grateful to those organizations and individuals who support the festival. Today, we'd especially like to thank Queen's University Archive, who is the event sponsor, Justin Connidis and Julia McArthur, who are the author patrons of Helen Humphreys, and our arts partner, Skeleton Park Press. This event is an hour long and includes a question and answer period. Feel free to type your questions in the Q&A box at any point during the event for the moderator. You'll find that box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you're on your phone, there's also a raise your hand function. So you can press *69 to do that, and we can unmute you to talk and ask your questions then. As a thank you for continuing to support Kingston Writers Fest and joining us for the virtual edition of the festival, we will randomly select a pre-registered participant of this event following our Q&A, and they will receive a copy of Helen's book. We'll be doing this for each onstage event through the festival, so we encourage you to sign up and join us for the rest of the events. Now I'm delighted to introduce this event's moderator, Tricia Knowles. Tricia is a cultural curator, festival and event producer, and arts promoter with a certificate in cultural planning and development from the University of British Columbia. A passionate reader, Tricia has been part of the Kingston Writers Fest team for many years, including 6 as marketing director. She's one of the founding members and artistic director of Calliope Collective, which is committed to creative placemaking and cultivation of a sense of wonder, and produces events that strive to connect people with the elements and cycles of nature. Tricia is also a stilt walker, body painter, and aspires to become an aspiring herbalist. Please welcome Tricia.
Good morning. Thank you so much, Ara. It's such a pleasure to be here today and such an honor to have the privilege to read this book. Helen Humphreys captured me with the river and the meditations and history found within that. And now with field study, I'm taken kind of back within and that reconnection and re-examination with nature. So it is my great privilege to introduce Ms. Humphreys today. Helen is the award-winning author of 9 novels, 4 books of poetry, and 5 works of creative nonfiction. She's won the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize, the City of Toronto Book Award, and Lambda Prize for Fiction, and her work has been shortlisted for the Governor General's Literary Award, the Trillium, and longlisted for the Dublin Impact Award and the BC National Award for Nonfiction. Definitely a long list of accolades. Several of her books were chosen by the New York Times as notable books of the year, and her work has been published internationally and has been optioned for stage, opera, TV, and film. She lives and writes and plays with us right here in Kingston, Ontario. Welcome, Helen.
Thanks, Tricia. It's nice to be here.
It's so fitting that we're chatting with you this week, being the autumn equinox, at this special place between warm and cold, light and dark, the life and death within nature. The final harvest is coming in. The leaves are beginning to change. We have abundance, we have loss, and it all seems somehow related to this journey that you went on at the Fowler Herbarium. So really fitting that you're with us this week. So thank you so much for being here. This beautifully creative nonfiction piece is about finding balance within. There are elements where you're reconnecting not only with nature, but with the stories and the history of nature itself. And through this studying, 144,000 plant specimens, was it?
Roughly, yeah.
That you went through. So finding the stories within the Fowler Herbarium, this year-long meditation of going through all of these plant specimens, you considered life, loss, and the importance of finding solace and balance within nature. So I was hoping that we could, although I am tempted to start at the end of the book because we're in fall, let's go full circle and we'll come back to the maples during this glorious season. But I thought we could start with a reading and you could tell us a little bit about your journey into the approach of the genesis of this book.
Right. Well, I began this book because I wanted to talk about human beings and nature through time, because I was increasingly, even before the pandemic, I have been going to nature for my own solace. And then I have also become, as everybody has, no doubt, more aware of the damage that the human world is doing to the natural world and the position that we're in now. And so I was thinking about those two things, about how on the one hand we have climate crisis, we have the ecosystem destruction, we have all of those things that we're living in. And I was also increasingly dependent on my connection to the natural world for my own well-being. So I was looking for a way to talk about how to reconcile those two things or think about those two things. And so I thought I would try to examine nature and human relationships through time. And so the herbarium seemed a perfect place to do that, because a herbarium is a dried plant library, and the plants have been pressed and they're on a piece of paper, but on that piece of paper where they've been pressed, all the specimens, there's also in the lower right-hand corner a little piece of paper like a business card where the collector has written the details of where they found the plant, the date, any information about the plant or the collecting location, anything, and sometimes other information that isn't really science related goes onto that little thing. So it's basically the moment, you're seeing the moment where someone cut a branch off a pine tree or they picked a flower from the forest floor. And so it's I think the only place I can think of where you can actually see the humans and nature operating through time like that in a precise way. So anyway, I decided to approach the herbarium as a kind of wilderness, and I just had a mandate to just sort of look through all the specimens, starting at the beginning and ending at the end. And I didn't really know what I would find or discover. And as it turns out, I discovered a lot, and some of it not to do really with, or to do tangentially with the herbarium, but a lot of things around life and death and other questions and things that I had actually been thinking about anyway. So before I started looking through the cabinet, so I have to say that herbariums are climate controlled locations because they have plant matter that has to be preserved. So they're cold, and the files where the specimens are stored are in big metal cabinets. So it's a kind of that sort of environment, although the Fowler in particular is in a beautiful place because it's at the Queen's Biological Station. So it's an hour north of Kingston up at Chaffee's Locks. And so you have a beautiful outlook from the window in the herbarium. So that was the kind of the locale. So before I started looking through the cabinets of the plants, I decided to read through the collector's notebooks. And I'm going to just read a little bit here about Roland Bechel's field books. And he was one of the early collectors at the herbarium and actually responsible for really adding to it and growing the collection and having it moved. Did he have it moved up? No, he didn't have it moved up there, but he had a lot to do with enhancing the collection, and he was a curator there. So I'm just going to read this a little bit. Bechel's field books are a lot like my own notebooks in that they contain a multitude of things, not all of them related to the task at hand. As well as his location notes for the various specimens he was collecting, Roland Bechel also put in personal observations or drew small sketches of a leaf or plant. He sometimes pressed a flower or a frond of grass between the pages of the field books, or included a list of expenses for a collecting excursion. On one such expense list, the items include cigarettes, sandwiches, a stay at the YMCA, and a present for someone back home. He also noted what was around him while he was on his field trips, talking about the first lilacs blooming, or stating that the sight of a young moose crossing a tidal bore in Moncton was not so impressive, but still surprising. What happens when working in the field is that the field itself begins to assert itself. In Bechel's notebooks, there is evidence of his having been outside when he was taking his notes, a squished mosquito on one of the pages, raindrops smudging the ink from his pen, a stray piece of grass caught in the crease of the spine. Being outdoors doing field work meant that Bechel was exposed to whatever was taking place there. It also meant that he noticed other life forms that were in the vicinity of his study area. He wrote small lists of the birds he saw when he was out in the woods and remarked on sightings in previous years. He once saw loon and her babies at a spot on the lake where he had gone to look for plant life, and he forever afterwards called the spot Loon Islet. Roland Bechel was a good observer, not just of the plants he was interested in recording and collecting, but also of the larger natural world. Reading his notebooks, I come to appreciate his sensibilities and the bits of his personality that are on display in some of the entries. He is dedicated, curious, and humane, and I grow fond of him as I read through all 24 of his notebooks. He described the sight of 15 nighthawks flying together and said that when they were diving, the feathers rattle. When talking of meeting a fellow botanist, he shrewdly observed his colleague's character as being that of an artist, idealistic and yet frustrated, and went on to wonder, why does Fabrio not collaborate with him? In a declaration of generosity, Bechel wrote, I will send him the liverworts from the copper swamp. What hadn't occurred to me before I began looking through the herbarium notations and the collector's field books was that some scientists were better observers than others, just as some artists are. It is not something that can be fully taught, but is perhaps a product of one's natural curiosity, and also maybe depends on how well a person can put themselves aside, their desires and ego, to focus on what is outside of and around them. People can be trained through art and science to be good observers, but to be a great observer perhaps depends on something innate. And I'll stop there.
I love that section as well, that line, but to be a great observer perhaps depends on something innate. What do you think those characteristics might have been after studying so many different people, so many different collectors, and how they take notes? What was essential or intuitive, I guess, about the amateurs especially? Was there something, a commonality between them that really stood out for you?
Well, I think it's partly what I said there, an ability to be able to put your own desires and your ego aside, right? That helps. But I also think in terms of the amateurs, it really helps to be passionate about whatever it is, you're interested in. So many of the amateur botanists actually became experts in a particular field and were, seen as being as knowledgeable as or sometimes more knowledgeable than some of the professional scientists. So those people had a passion for whatever it is they were studying. And I think the passion really helps. So I would say a combination of those two things, I think, a kind of passion. So an intense interest in something, but also an ability to not focus entirely on yourself, right? To be able to put yourself aside. Mm-hmm. I think that that's what makes a great observer as opposed to a good observer.
Do you notice now your own observations shifting when you're out on your walks?
No, I think I'm a pretty good observer. I think that's like one of my strong things, actually, if I could, if I'd say anything. So, but of course, the more you do it, the better you get. So it's, yeah, I think that's part of what writers do is observe, right? That's what makes a writer. That's a thing. It's the details. And so to see the details, you have to be looking and seeing things in places that maybe other people aren't seeing them.
You start with lichen when you're going through the collection, which I absolutely love. And you mention Adele Crowder from the Fowler speaks to the romantic tastes of the early 19th century botanist. What do you think it was that was so romantic about this act of collecting, but about moss and lichen specifically?
Yeah, well, I talk about lichen in particular to related to Bechel because Bechel was a lichenologist. So that's why I'm talking about lichen in the beginning of the book there. And what she meant by that was that because lichen grows year round, it doesn't like other plants kind of, bloom and subside, but lichen is ever present. So it's eternal. So it's growing all of the time. And lichenologists, well, these days they're studying it a lot for pollution to see, how to measure the effects of pollution on environment. But lichen grows in places that are undisturbed. So its presence in cemeteries or caves or somewhere that isn't going to have human interference. And so what she meant by the romantic aspect of it was that some of the lichenologists like to study the lichen in very sort of romantic places like the tomb of Abelard or the Père Lachaise cemetery, or, there were these very sort of, and they would study the lichens there because you can see it's appealing to go to those places. So that's what she meant by that.
And you notice now a lot of people are studying the lichen for pollution and whatnot. What do you think has changed from those early days of North American settler science and around botany compared to how the plants are being studied today? Is this still being preserved, the plant specimens still being preserved in the same way? How has that shifted?
Yeah, so specimens are being added all the time to herbaria. But, in the beginning with incomers, they came to a place where, of course, there were people already who had a long relationship with the land and the plant life, but that in that early settler period, they were really cataloging what they found. And that was sort of what they wanted to do in terms of plants. So that's why there was a very active kind of botanical interest at that point. And now I think, I'm not a botanist, so I can't sort of say, I can only say what I kind of discovered or think, but it's a lot of what's happening is plants are being used to find out what the negative things are from the human impact on plant life. So lichens are being used to measure pollution and various things that's what's happening. But as I said, specimens are still being added to herbaria because what's great about herbarium specimens is that you get a range of specimen. You're not just getting, one thing doesn't look just one way. You're being able to look at, 200 different examples of the same plant. So you're seeing a different range of evolution within that plant. And so they're still very used, and they're used for DNA from plants. And now a lot of collections are being digitized, so then they become available to people all over the world. So they're still a they're a valuable thing.
And did you notice a large difference in how the specimens were being collected, depending on whether or not they were a scientist or an amateur?
It doesn't, I don't think it depended so much on whether it was a scientist or an amateur. It's just individual people have an individual style where it came to sort of preserving the plant. So there were people who would kind of rip the plant straight out of the earth, and then they would press it on the paper, and all the roots would have dirt still clinging to them, and it really was literally like ripped out and slammed down, and then that was it. And other people who very carefully took the dirt off the roots, separated the roots out. Some people made little pencil sketches where they enlarged something that was quite small to show it, or did something in cross section. Some people put multiple examples of a plant on one page. Other people just put one, so it's very, I found that kind of a little bit of a fingerprint of the collector, just that matched somehow their personality or who they were. And there were particular collectors who I was always happy to see their work because they did something that, that I liked. Like there was MS Bebb, Michael Bebb, who collected willows, and he was an amateur, and he had his own private willow grove where he had, hundreds of specimens of willows. he always very carefully separated out each frond and each leaf of the willow, and he often made kind of very artistic arrangements. So I always liked finding one of his willows.
It's easier to take in the information when it's presented to you in a certain way.
Well, it's appealed to me. I mean, I also kind of liked the people who just grab the plant out of the earth, honestly, too, because there's something in that that's kind of great.
So fascinating, must have. And
Yeah.
I know there was something mentioned about when the plant was preserved, when it was taken. So what were the vast differences between the samples that you were going through? There are so many different specimens of one type of plant and how they were collected, but also to when.
Yeah, when and where, because the all herbaria, or most of them, have plants from all over the world, right? So in the early days, there was a lot of trading of specimens, or you would, sometimes someone would die, especially an amateur, and then their herbarium would be distributed amongst other herbaria. So you would, so there's there's the same plant in different places in the world, and then that same plant has been collected at different times. So sometimes it was collected when it was sort of, fully, if it's a flower, when it was fully in bloom. Other times it might have been collected a bit after that or a bit before that. So that's what I mean. There's a range, there's just a range of examples when you're looking at any particular plant. That was interesting.
I wanted to go back to winter. The winter section is so fabulous because you can really get sucked into your narrative of this journey that you've taken on. I had mentioned that you started with lichen, and then you had mentioned the ferns, but tell me about the pines.
The pines, yeah, I really liked the pines. So the collection was organized in terms of evolutionary biology, and it starts with ferns, and then it goes from ferns to pines, I think. Does it go from ferns to pines? I think it does. Anyway, the pines occupy a big series of cabinets. And the thing that I noticed about pines, first of all, was that they smell like pines. And that was kind of fast. The thing that I hadn't anticipated about the plants was that some of them still retained characteristics of when they were alive, even though they were dead. So, a pine that had been dead 150 years still smelled like a pine. And that was kind of incredible. A pussy willow, 100 years old, was still soft. So there were all these characteristics of life in the dead plant that was really interesting to me. And I also, I felt sometimes that in a sense the herbarium was this in-between place, where life and death kind of were together. And yeah, it was kind of fascinating. I loved the for the smell of the pines. It was amazing. It was like being in a pine forest.
I know that you have a couple of readings, and I'm not sure if this is one of them, but you talk about the ferns being no longer alive, but still looking as though they are. And that was when I got a little sucked into that section. Is such a wonderful herbarium is a catalog of dead plants, but perhaps it also tells us equally about what it is to be alive, that the dead and the living not only share the same space, but are in fact equal. And I know you went through some loss through the writing of this book. And did you find in that, like you said, in that in-between place, a certain solace? Did you find that you were able to grieve and move through and take comfort in being in a place of such balance?
Well, what was interesting, and what I don't know if comfort or solace is the right word for it, but what I liked was discovering that I thought that is certainly in the herbarium anyway, there was an equality between death and life. And I had, this is the thing with, being a human being who has suffered any kind of loss, is that when something is dead, it's sort of, I think I don't know, are we told to like leave it behind, or, you know, you move forward with the living? But in my experience, the dead still occupy a very living place, you know, within us. And so it was sort of nice to have that kind of confirmed, I guess, by what was happening inside the herbarium, where yes, this pine is dead, but it still smells like a pine. When I close my eyes, I could be in a forest that smells like, you know, a pine forest. And yet here I am with all these dead specimens. So it was very mixed up to me with my experience of people who have died in my life and how they're still present in some way. And so I really did feel that there was, that the dead and the living were equal, and there was a real equality to the space they took up. So I took that from the herbarium and it was just a way to sort of reaffirm what I was already kind of feeling for myself. I had this recurring dream when I was at the herbarium, which was a strange one, which was that in the dream, there were all the sort of the dead people, there were dead people and living people that I had in my life. And I couldn't in the dream tell who was dead and who was alive. I couldn't distinguish it. And I think that was when I was on the edge of sort of thinking this thing about the herbarium, that what I liked about it was that there were so many characteristics of life in amongst the dead things. So yeah, it was more of a kind of affirmation, I guess, than anything. But it was really something I'll always take as a lesson from that time that I spent there. So I have a little piece about pines, if that I could read, and it's about one of the collectors. So what I did in the book was I tried to find out about the collectors, and many of them I was able to find some things out about them. Some it was impossible, just based on that there was just no information, especially with the women, because their collecting label would say Miss so-and-so, and I wouldn't be able to find at all who that was. But one of the collectors from Kingston, so I'm going to read this little part, was a woman called Annie Boyd, and she was a collector in the late 1800s, and she is interesting. I'll read her little section. I think it contains all the information about her. So these little biographies I did with the collectors, they're just small little stories of the collectors, and they kind of go through the book. Annie A. Boyd collected over 400 specimens for the Fowler Herbarium over a 2-year period, 1897 and 1898, when she was an undergraduate and then a master's student at Queen's. The science program at the university had recently opened its classes to women students. Annie Boyd collected plants in a range around Kingston that could be reached by bicycle. The white pine, Pinus strobus, that she added to the herbarium's collection was sampled on July 7, 1897 at Cartwright Point, a neighborhood on the St. Lawrence River just to the east of Kingston, named for Richard Cartwright, a former United Empire Loyalist from Albany, New York, and one of the first British colonists to settle in Kingston in 1784. After her time at Queen's, Annie Boyd took a job as a science teacher at Morrisburg Collegiate, remaining there for 27 years. Because Cartwright Point is close to where I live, I drive out to look at the white pines. It is not the summer day that Annie Boyd had when she wheeled across the causeway and up Berryfield Hill on her way to the point, but is instead a cold April morning with a brisk wind and scraps of cloud moving fast across the pale blue sky. Winter has just retreated from the landscape, and the deciduous trees have yet to leaf, so it is easy to spot Annie's white pines, as they are the only green in the canopy, and they tower 20 or 30 feet above the other trees. The point has houses and cottages peppered along its spine, but they are inserted into the woods that cover the land, not carved out of it. So the tree cover has probably remained fairly consistent from Annie Boyd's time to mine. I drive the short length of the point and back again, past the mossy slabs of limestone that rise out of last year's dead leaves. The trunks of the pines are too big to encircle with my arms when I get out to try. It is easier to see the scope of the pines from the road that runs across the top of Cartwright Point, because it is on a rise and the land falls away below it. The white pines run in a feathery stutter through the whole point, their massive green tops often touching and all slanting about 15 degrees to the east, because the prevailing wind off Lake Ontario is westerly. When Annie Boyd bicycled out here in 1897, she was probably collecting more specimens than just the white pine. She might have come for most of a day, leaning her bicycle up against one tree and then another, creeping through the woods in search of flowers and ferns. The white pine didn't have to be looked for. It was simply there in abundance, sighing above her head as she walked through the woods. The wind in the branches of the trees sounding exactly like her breath or mine. Stop that. I think you're muted, Tricia.
Sorry about that. Did you actually get out to try to wrap your arms around the tree?
I did. I'm not lying. I wrote down everything that I did in the book. So yeah.
Everything that you studied and read about that existed locally, did you go hunting for? I know in the next section of the book, as we get into spring, talking about other trees and the red oak. I know specifically you had gone to see if it still existed. Did you do that with many of the specimens that you encountered throughout your time at the herbarium?
Yes, anything that was mentioned that was local, I went looking for it. And often I couldn't find it, something, wasn't, that was mentioned 100 years ago is no longer there. But I did find some things. Yeah. And the white pines were one of them. So that was interesting.
That's so beautiful. And this book really is quite personal. You share memories of childhood, the gratitude that you feel still for a family friend at your childhood cottage for drawing you into the practice of identifying plants as you walked through the forest. And I wondered if you could tell us how that experience compares to your ability to now identify plants on your walks, but if that's been a journey back to self, that place of meditation by revisiting the art of naming these plants and learning more about them, if that's been a journey kind of back to self or back to that child.
Well, I don't think, fortunately or unfortunately, I've actually changed very much from when I was a child. So I still do all the same things and have all the same interests. So I don't, I think it's an ongoing journey. I think that moment of, I was 8 when I first learned the names of some of the plants because I was taken around by this, I guess, the father of friends who was a geologist. So he spent a lot of time out in the woods, and he told me the names of certain things. So that moment was a kind of revelation where I suddenly knew the names of things. But I think it's kind of an ongoing revelation. Anytime I learn a new plant, it's that same sense of wonder and also connection and being able to fit it into a kind of larger scheme of things. So I don't think, it's just never left me, really.
That awe. I know we had traveled to Sequoia a few years back, and just touching the General Sherman's, the world's largest tree by mass, and then seeing in the news protecting the sequoias, especially the General Sherman, and having them. Do you feel that sense of connection with what is happening within nature and with climate change, and seeing the plants how they once were and how they are now, and that difference? How does that speak to you on emotional level?
Well, as I say, and as I said at the beginning, it was trying to find as I'm sure many people are trying to find some place to reconcile to things like the fact that human beings have destroyed so much and are destroying so much, and that we have to work so hard to even protect the smallest thing, and it's not always possible, with the fact that this kind of reliance on nature. And especially during the pandemic, I think a lot of people have relied on nature more than usual for their well-being. But it's an ongoing, I don't think, it's just an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing thing. I just read this morning this great little article of this 95-year-old botanist in England who is riding a horse for 11 weeks to kind of raise money to help protect these rare plants in the place where she lives, because they're they're just being destroyed. and they've been there since the Ice Age. And so she rode a horse for 11 weeks to raise money. Anyway, so people do things, right, to help, and it's just ongoing. It's ongoing. It'll be ongoing, I imagine, for all of our lives.
Sorry, just a little off topic there. On topic, but off track. I wanted to go back to the collectors, and I was curious through your research if there was any insight, these poetic, beautiful labels that popped up between the different collectors, if there was any insight as to why one collector chose to collect a specific type of plant over another. Why do you think one chooses one over another?
It's a personal decision, I think. Why do we choose anything over anything else? I think that's very personal, and who knows, right? I mean, I don't know why Michael Bebb chose willows. I mean, it's mysterious, but the amateurs, you can say that with. You can say, with somebody that's a scientist, there might be a reason, more of a reason why they go into what they go into. But the amateurs, it seemed to be very sort of driven by some sort of passion, and I don't know what precipitated that passion, but I like the mysteriousness of that. It's interesting. Who knows, right? They're all dead now, so who knows?
You're not a collector yourself, are you?
No.
No. If you were, though, what would you collect?
I think if I was going to be study anything, I think I would do lichens, because I do like the romantic places where lichens are found, and I also like the fact that there's an eternalness to lichens. They're accreting, they're slowly growing outwards, and they're there through all the seasons. They're there through all the weather. There's something I think is in winter they're quite green. They look, when you come across them in the forest, they look so green.
That's so stunning.
Yeah, I think I think that would be something that I would like. I would like to go to Père Lachaise or all those romantic places and look at the lichens over and over again.
I noticed later in the book, I was trying to take us through the seasons of the book, and there's this really beautiful section that you write longingly or wistfully about Frances Theodora Parsons, and taking long walks with her friend who was a botanical illustrator. And I was curious, these two women were responsible for How to Know the Wildflowers, which is a field guide, incredibly popular, sold out in a remarkable amount of time. And I wondered what makes that your favorite of the field guides that came up throughout this year-long journey for you.
Yeah, well, it was the first field guide, so that's something. It was the first kind of settler field guide written. It was written by a woman, and it was illustrated by a woman. Also, she prioritized the indigenous names for plants and indigenous uses as well, which I liked and thought was important. And also she organized it in the way that we tend to organize guides now, by color, and also by what came into bloom when in that particular color. So color is a way that, a lot of modern field guides are organized. But how it came about was she had a husband who died young, and she went for long walks to get over his death, and she walked with a friend who happened to be a botanical illustrator, and they talked about the flowers they saw on their walks, and so they did this guide together, and it sold out. Yeah, I think 2 weeks after it was published, it sold out. So it's still a really good field guide. It was published in the 1800s, and it's still a great guide.
You mentioned that she was one of the few who mentioned the indigenous names. And I noticed there was some introspection throughout the book, noticing that a lot of the information about the plants pre-settler was not referred to, was not mentioned throughout the herbarium, that there were very few mentions of that. Do you see a change in that now, like with the specimens that were collected closer to our time?
Well, it's more like now, these days. Back then, I mean, of course, it was a settler colonial pastime, botanizing and all of that. So it's not surprising. I mean, it was the limitation I came up with for myself in the collection that at some point I had trouble with that. But the way that herbariums are being used these days is changing. And there is a lot of indigenous traditional knowledge being incorporated into herbaria. There's the Navajo Nation in the US have a herbarium that has over 10,000 specimens in it. That's a tribal herbarium, and there are other tribal herbariums. And then so things are changing in the way the use of the herbarium, the way that the herbariums are being used. So I'm glad. I mean, that's a really good development. But yes, it did come out of empire, right? It came out of botany as empire, and so it is what it is. But it is changing. So.
Mm-hmm. I especially appreciated that you wrote a bit about your conflict with that and coming to terms with that through the book. I wanted to go back to Marion Satterley and the Botanical Illustrations, because I know that is one of your favorite pastimes. And throughout the book, there's a peppering of your own pieces, which is great, as well as the plate printings and the pressing artwork. It's a gorgeous book. I wondered if you might be able to show us a few of your favorite illustrations throughout the book.
I don't know throughout the book. Okay, I'll just show you. I just to show you how it's laid out. So there are specimens from the herbarium, like so, that are, on the pages, and it's really heavily illustrated book. I think it's really pretty. Hopefully everybody else does. But I have some of my own illustrations. I'm just trying to find out where they are. Yeah, so sometimes those are mine, around the margins, around the top, little illustrations. And in my own, in my time, I'm continue to work on that, try to get better. And I'll just show you what I'm doing now, which is a little study of hickory nuts and all their guises. So
what's the journey been like for you, learning about botanical illustration and enhancing your own art practice?
Well, it's been great to learn something new, right? I loved it. It's great to be a beginner. So I've loved it. Like, I've been doing it for a couple of years, maybe 3 years now. Mm-hmm. And I just try to keep, learning and learning and learning. And yeah, it's fantastic. It's fantastic to be a beginner at something. It's pure pleasure, right? It's pure pleasure to be a beginner. It's less pleasurable when you think you know something about something. So I'm going to try and stay in that beginner place as long as possible.
Yeah, your drawing of Queen Anne's lace also makes an appearance in the book, and you mentioned that, like milkweed, it has a summer and winter persona. Have you seen a correlation between plants like that and the people who were studying and collecting them, between when they were collected in the different seasons and in their artwork as well?
Botanical illustrators you're talking about now? Yeah, botanical illustration there's two, as I learned when I took a course last year. There's botanical illustration and botanical art. I think I'm more on the botanical art side. Botanical illustration is about creating a drawing that, in the absence of the plant, can stand in for the plant. So it has to be technically perfect, right? And you get all the parts of the plant. So it's less interpretive. It's exact. It's a replica, but it's in drawing. So when you see a botanical illustration, you often see the roots, the leaves. You see a dissection of the flower head, seeds, anything like that. Anything to do with that plant in its sort of life span is presented in the illustration, but different from botanical art, which is more kind of interpretive, and you don't have to include everything and all that. So
it is a stunning book. What was your reaction the first time you saw it when it was
Yeah, it's beautiful. It was more beautiful than I had imagined it would be. I also love the size of it. It's quite small and fits in your hand nicely. Yeah, I think my publisher did a fantastic job. It's really beautiful. It's a beautiful book. I hope people think so
Yeah,
when
it's
they see it.
stunning, stunning. We are going to open things up to some Q&A. So if anyone in the audience or the participants of this have a question for Helen, there is a Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You can type your questions into that. As people are typing their questions in, wondering about Thoreau, and you dedicate a whole section of the book. And what made you decide to do that rather than include him in with the kind of examination or exploration of all of the plants, as you've mentioned the other collectors?
Well, Thoreau had his own herbarium.
Mhm.
And I just kind of, and his herbarium is digitized if anybody wants to look at it. So as well as Emily Dickinson's, they're in the collection of Harvard University and they're digitized. They're really nice. Both of them are great to look at. Emily Dickinson also had a herbarium. So I wanted to talk about his herbarium and the way that he collected. So I talk about him a little bit as a collector, I think, because I talk about how he puts the plants down on the paper and whether it was actually him or his sister Sophia, because she helped. They did it together, so it could have been that she actually mounted the specimens. But also I wanted to talk about him because our idea of nature as settlers comes a lot from his idea of nature. But I also wanted to talk about his time, which is idealized, I think, from our time as being a time that was very saturated with nature, like he was just in nature. But in his time, it was very apocalyptic. The woods were constantly, first of all, they were being chopped down because everything was just logged to death. And the woods were constantly being set on fire by the wood-fired steam trains that were going by, and the cinders would fly out and set the forest constantly on fire. Deer, coyotes, and beavers were hunted to extinction, pretty much. So in Thoreau's life, he only saw a deer twice, and he noted it as being this wondrous occasion. So, we have this idea of his world as being more ideal than our world, but it wasn't necessarily. It was just different, right? Different things were at play, but he also sought out nature and loved it, but he had a lot of things going on that weren't about loving nature at all. So anyway,
To discuss with
yeah.
society. Yeah. Okay, so I'm seeing there's a couple questions in the chat. So I'm just going to try and go between the Q&A box and the chat box here. So Zabe has a question for you, Helen. Compared to your other books, especially The Ghost Orchard, did you gain any new ways to approach your writing?
That's a great question. Yes, I think with this book, more than any other book that I have done, I just let it sort of naturally unfold. I mean, I had my big parameter that I was going to look at all the specimens in the herbarium. But aside from that, I had no idea what I was going to do or did do. So I just let it kind of unfold organically, and whatever kind of happened or was happening, I put it into the book, for good or bad. That's for the reader to judge. But for myself as the writer, it felt that it was a very organic kind of book. And I think that for me now, life and this stage of my career, I'm going to lean in that direction more. I like it better than planning something and just overlaying your sort of desires and the way you think something should go on top of something, rather than just letting it be whatever it chooses to be. So that's.
Sorry. This is truly a beautiful and superbly designed book, Tanya says. Were you inspired by the layout of period books and collections for the design of this work?
I did not design it. So there was a fantastic designer called Natalie, for the publisher, who designed it, did a beautiful job. I'm just going to look up her last name so I can give her proper credit. So she was Natalie Olson. She did the design, and it's a fantastic design. So she took her cue. I think she did probably take her cue a little bit from some older things as well, but it was all her. It was all her work, the design.
There's a lot of love for her happening in the chat right now,
Yeah.
just about how beautiful the illustrations being amazing, theirs and yours. Laura is asking, just lots of love from Laura there. Love how, what is it? Quercus? Your red quercus pops on page 91. Now I'm really curious. I have to
That's
find
the oak.
Oh, that's the oak. Yeah. This was a beautiful story too about the red oak when you get to this section of visiting the cemetery and whatnot. But yeah, that is a really stunning image. My lighting is not the greatest, but when you get your hands on a copy of this, I know when I was setting up for the window display at Novel Idea, they were just unpacking the books and it just felt so serendipitous and beautiful. If there is a question that you put in the chat, folks, and I'm just trying to kind of scroll through and find them. If you want to copy and paste them into the Q&A box, if I've missed it, that would be really great. We had a couple questions about being a collector as well as being an observer, but I think you've mentioned that you're not yet collecting. Do you think you will?
Well, I don't collect to collect, but I do collect to draw. So, I'm always taking things, like I have so many hickory nuts on my desk right now to draw all those little hickory nuts because they keep going brown and I keep having to get new ones. So I'm always collecting in that regard, but I'm not collecting to keep. I guess my collecting is to draw the thing and then I keep the drawing. So it's a kind of a collecting, I guess.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Gerton asked a little earlier when we were talking about the difference between life and death. She said, is this something, the realization that the difference between death and life not being as solidly defined as you thought, that would interest you in digging deeper in that area?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah. I don't know how much deeper, like I do go into it in the book. So I'm not sure. I mean, I'll always think about it, I guess, and maybe it'll come up in some other book. But right now, I think I've kind of gone through it in this book, and I'm not sure that I will talk about it in depth again. But certainly, it'll always be in my mind, and I'll always be cognizant of it for everything going forward. Anyway.
Elizabeth says, I love the time travel.
Yeah.
What is it about the history of the subjects that you study when you're taking us on these meditative journey, whether it was the ghost orchard with apples, the reflection, the river was a little bit different, but also still had those moments of contemplation historically and the characters relating to their environment, much like the collectors relating to their specimens throughout field study. What is it about the history that draws you in so deeply?
Well, it's just this idea, we live in a place of layered time, and we're living in one layer right now, but there's all these other layers that went before us, and I like to get a glimpse into what they were, even if the thing itself is no longer there. If you knew it was there, that's a kind of reality, right? That points to that layer, and it points to this sort of the way that time operates. I mean, in one of the notes from one of the collectors, he talked about old growth forest that used to be on Montreal Street in Kingston here. So that's, I like imagining that. I mean, it's not there now, but, just to even drive down Montreal Street and think, okay, there is old growth forest here. That's, I like thinking about that. It means it's not lost to nothing, to oblivion, right? It's if you remember something or you have some record of something, even just to point towards it, it means that it's not consigned to oblivion, which I think is important.
Dorian would like to know if you are able to divulge the subject matter of your next book.
Yes, my next book actually is coming out, it's coming out in 2022, and I'm writing a memoir about dogs. My dogs in particular, but also writing in dogs and other writers' dogs. So that's my next book.
Oh, dog lovers are just
Thanks.
going to flock. That's amazing. I wondered if you would do us the honor of closing us out with one final reading.
Okay, I will. I'm going to read you another little piece about a collector. And this is a husband and wife team, and they had a label that at the herbarium was just, the label was J.G. Lemon and wife, which drove me crazy, of course. So I had to find out who they were and why. I don't know why they were called that. Anyway, this is the story of J.G. Lemon and wife. John Gill Lemon was a botanist, Civil War veteran, and descendant of the explorer Henry Hudson. He and his wife, Sarah Plummer Lemon, an artist, botanist, and intellectual, spent 8 months of every year collecting plants out in the field, only home in Oakland, California during the winters. They rented their house out when they weren't in it, and then lived off that rental income for the winter months. Lemon had enlisted in the Union Army after attending university in Michigan. He was captured and incarcerated in the Andersonville prison, a prison of war camp so brutal that almost a third of the 45,000 prisoners died from disease caused by unsanitary conditions and lack of food, or violence at the hands of the guards or prisoners who had organized into gangs to take what meager food they could from their fellow prisoners. When he was released in 1865, John Lemon went to California to recover his health. While there, he met Sarah Plummer, who had traveled from New York City, where she had trained as a teacher and studied art at the Cooper Union. She had worked as a nurse during the Civil War and contracted a bad case of pneumonia. And she had moved to California also for her health. She opened a circulating library in Santa Barbara and began botanizing in the countryside and making watercolor paintings of her specimens. John and Sarah married in 1881, and the specimen of Juba's bush in the herbarium was collected on their honeymoon. They were equal partners in their botanical collecting and in the publishing of papers, but the credits always identified them as J.G. Lemon and wife. Sarah Lemon was, in fact, the more successful of the pair. She was an accomplished painter, and through her efforts, the golden poppy was chosen as the state flower for California. He suffered chronic health problems all of their life together because of his time in Andersonville prison and died early as a result. Sarah outlived him by almost 20 years. In 1894, an article about the Lemons appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle under the headline, "Botany is Their Hobby," and it described one of their collecting excursions. Quote, "Each carried a short alpine staff, and one of them carries strapped on the back a large tin box for specimens. It is also necessary to carry a notebook and sometimes a blanket if they intend to remain away overnight, for it grows cold rapidly on those great heights after sunset. On these occasions, the food for the day is carried in a large pot with a handle and a leathern strap. In this can is a gallon of rather thick cocoa with crackers stirred in it, which answers for food and drink during the day. Water is out of the question."
I recall that section so vividly, and I was thinking the combination of, this writing that you were able to find, your journey, the specimens all together, just this incredible journey from cover to cover. And I was mentioning before we started that I have all these tabs on my book because I was jumping back and forth and back and forth. I was so excited to get my hands on a copy of it. And then I made myself sit down and just read it through and experience that journey with you. And it was such a delight and an honor to be able to do that. So if nobody has any other questions, I think that's time. Oh, that was great timing. Thank you so much, Helen.
Thank you, Tricia. Thanks for all your questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you.
So thank you again to Helen and Tricia for this wonderful conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning, we are doing draws for copies of all of the books for all of the events that we have. So I'd like to congratulate Anne Widak, who is the winner of a copy of Field Study Meditations on a Year at the Herbarium. And if you didn't win a copy, but you'd like to get one, I would encourage you to visit our local independent bookseller, Novel Idea Books here in Kingston, or the equivalent from wherever you happen to be tuning in. I want to thank you so much for joining us at this event, and be sure to check out kingstonwritersfest.ca for the rest of our great lineup.